Shall we begin it? I have one here. Rise to dust, the Scion of Hope. Chapter 1. A Destiny Ignites. The night I realized the world would change was not the night I had expected. Instead, I regret to say, that realization came much later, almost too late. But our story doesn't begin there. Our story begins in the capital city of Valcorana. Although it was night, the sky was far from black, for the air was filled with the light of many prismatic fireworks. This night was special, not because the war had finally ended, nor because of the birth of the new prince, but because on the other side of the capital, in a small and quiet house to the south, another child was also born. Fenora screamed in anguish as she lay on a small bed, swarmed by midwives attempting to help her with her next push. She battled the pain of emerging life, fighting to stay present as her mind wavered between this moment and moments past. One of the midwives attempted to calm her enough for the next push, and after she began, her mind retreated into her past, where her memory is now stung with virulent agony. Fenora's emerald eyes pierced through the ocean of black clouds that now rolled over the sky and let no light pass save the flash of fell lightning which clung to the faces of those beside her. They looked ahead in worry, seeing through the strikes of light a great and terrible tower of starless obsidian. This spire of endless night seemed not to bow to the wills of man, instead standing tall in defiance against the hope of tomorrow. She looked to her commanders beside her as the rain began to descend from the sky and rip away their remaining warmth with tempestuous vigor. The commander, bearing a great helmet in the shape of a silver lion's mane, extended his blade with a cry to charge. The rain struck his sword and bounced off as if recoiling from dread as the armies advanced. As they began their charge, winds like fervent whispers sped past them. The horses snuffed through the water pouring over their snouts as they charged forward, shaking the very earth around them. There were as many foes as the eyes could see, swarms of seemingly ceaseless minions stretching into the distance, beings of black and tar-filled flesh shook as lightning coursed through them, and ignited their wills to their dark master. The forces struck upon one another without mercy. Their bodies cracked and their blood burst to stain the lands around them. Their spears shattered against the night and all its foul denizens of wretched blight. Fenora screamed as the midwives rushed around her and tried to calm her. She swung her hand back and knocked over a pail of water that landed on the ground with a vicious splash. She screamed and panted before falling back into her mind. Fenora struck through the ranks with swift justice, as did her companions beside her. As they neared the dark tower of Uerzoth, the grim host unleashed a black chant through the air to poison the spirits around them. Time is failing, world is falling, black is calling, death is dawning, here to descended down the unforgiving height of the spire, the armies continued their fight below. Finally, he landed with a crunch of dooming thunder and began attacking without hindrance. He threw large bursts of violet lightning at his foes, the light of which was now mirrored in the sky above, and in between each flash, the faces of the soldiers and the damned were illuminated below, as if each flash was the breath of life, and each darkening was the face of death around them. Venora's sweat flooded off her body and soaked the bed beneath her. She writhed in seemingly ceaseless pain, against which the midwives could not contend, though they scrambled to comfort her. She had not yet left her memories. The sky continued to gasp for mercy from the relentless onslaught of light. Venora stood in the throne room of the tower, with her commanders beside her, and before them came a figure of darkness, wearing robes of cruel black, lined with glowing blue runes, and armed with a sword of cold and dark metal that rung out with violet fire. His boots of sharp metal scraped against the ground as they approached, and Venora looked around in worry. Venora was fading in and out of the stains on her mind when she felt the warm grip of a hand in hers. She looked up through teary eyes and strained to make out the calm smile of a woman. She then fell once more into her memories. The starlit host of silver warriors were beginning to be overtaken by their dark foes. From the tower, Venora looked down to see the man who had jumped, now standing as still as silence in the thick of battle, looking up at her, directly into her soul. Venora stared as he turned away and felt tears rush down her eyes as a mass of light began to gather in the center of the field below. Her heart stilled as she gripped the walls adjacent to the ledge of the throne room. All on the field looked to see this massing of light before it finally sped out with utter destruction. It tore those around it, and the black tower began to explode violently as massive chunks were ripped from its structure, until at last the wave of light engulfed all. Venora felt a tingle of surreal strain course through her, and heard the cries of a small child as her mind returned to the world. She slowly laid her head back as tears drained from her eyes, freezing to her veins, like the sealing of fates now past, and the bleeding away of old dreams. They melted off her face, only to land on the bed with glittering hope, and a hollowed cry that dared not forget for whom they were shed. A newborn, crying with life, was brought and placed into her arms. She looked to it in shaking victory. Its breaths were real, just as hers. She finally gazed upon its face in wonder. As she held the baby in her quivering arms, she took full notice of the woman beside her and said, "Xaqara, you honor me with your presence. I did not think I would see you here." Xaqara responded gently, "I would not miss the birth of your child, although the world is distracted with the birth of the prince as well tonight. I would not soon forget a dear friend, nor fail to be by her side on such a glorious day. Yes, but for once I am actually happy that I am forgotten, that people are still busy celebrating the end of the war, when now in such days we will have time for the birth of our youth. Because for the first time since the days before Valcorana, my child will not have the weight of the world on her shoulders. She owes no bond nor obligation to the people in the streets. She has a chance to have a normal life and live these golden days in peace." Xaqara smiled knowingly. She calmly refuted, "I know which you wish of her, but don't take away all chance of her becoming something great. Let her at least choose what path she may, for it is her life. I know you think that giving her away will keep her safe, but such is not your call and will of destiny. Fenora sat in silence for a moment, then answered, I cannot tell you what path she will take in the end, but no matter what, she will grow to be a strong woman, the strongest woman I will ever know. That much of her destiny is certain, but no longer should she have to shed her blood at its demand. My line has given enough. Xaqara softly closed her eyes in surrender and smiled. She slowly reopened them, then questioned, Do you know what you shall call her? Fenora responded without doubt, I shall call her Amelia. Xaqara's smile widened. That is a beautiful name. The two looked to each other once more as the light of the last fireworks faded in the distance, leaving the night sky barren once more. 26 years later. Bright, valiant sunlight burnished the afternoon sky over Valcorana. It landed like a fine silk upon the rooftops, as if it were a blanket tucking them in before the fall of night. It expanded across the fields and the great grasses, and on this particular day, it worked its way to a young and delicate rose that sprouted through the dishevelled gravel of a southern market alleyway. A special bloom, wreathed in the colours of twilight, that even the harshest winds would respect as they ventured to kiss its petals. A rose of dark light in such a place was seldom heard of. They are known only to blossom for two occasions: when the power of the great Archons is near, or when the designs of destiny begin to unveil themselves. The rose, however, was trampled into oblivion, for the market was bustling with various preoccupied residents and travellers, some of whom were from the nearby continent of Rangrast, who brought finely woven baskets, fishing supplies, and fine leathers for trade. There were also many merchants and traders from the great and wealthy continent of Eorrid, who brought a myriad of fine silks and linens. They came clad in outfits as tall as their egos, and were heading toward the high district to sell their wares. Chiefly in this stampede of people were a great many poverty-stricken residents that composed the whole south of the city. The usual occupants of the market were not the only ones about on this fine eve, for now there walked a troop of tall, finely armoured soldiers and guards in formation throughout the streets. Their armour was a shimmering raiment of red, as if blood itself had been preserved in metallic membrane. Some carried behind them rustic velvet drapes as thick as the veil of winter's bark, while the others' capes were deep red and flecked with bronze. Their swords were well made, and their arrow shafts constructed of pearl wood, with a single mark of red in the feather to indicate to whom they belonged. Atop their heads sat helms of red metal, lined in bronze, and set with two tall blades at the brow that rose and fanned slightly out like the wings of a drake. The helms' visors came to the point that stopped just below the chin, and were carved with two wide eye openings to mimic the gaze of a fey drake. A tail of dark horsehair fell from the top of each, and was entwined with braided ribbons of red, and the collars of their helms were layered with panels to guard their necks. Such armour varied only slightly from that of the city guards, who lingered throughout the capital, nodding at these red-clad orders led the troop of red guards. His honey eyes were sweet but condemning against his rich brown complexion. They pierced the false armors and strengths his enemies often possessed. Seldom did a smile dare to creep onto his solemn face, but he had not been made general of the capital for his kindness. Someone of greater mirth trailed behind him, a kind-faced man who smiled actively at all the people he passed. His dirty blonde hair ran across his forehead and stopped just over his brow, kissed with light and delicate waves that were adorned with a simple gold crown. This was to signify his authority, for he was the Prince of Valcorana, and Caithus was his name. His influence reached across all lands far and wide, for the capital city of the continent of Androth was also the capital city of the entirety of Eorrid. The crown he bore was one of the few pieces of gold left in all the lands, for the scarcely discovered gold deposits had been bled dry, resulting in a worldwide gold shortage. Now only to the north did the golden people of Eorrid wed it often. The prince was greatly cherished by the citizens of Valcorana for his constant visitations. His stay was no different. He journeyed to the famed tavern known as the Wayward Wyvern, known for its spiced and fruity brews. The prince and his company filed through the door in their familiar order. The tavern master, who was talking with a few locals, jumped up and hastened toward the door with a deep bow. "My prince, what a surprise to see you again so soon." During this exchange, a hefty woman sat in the back, giggling as a squalling man attempted to court her. No doubt such a man talked to the woman so named Bulbara for her assets, which were the size of dragon melons. Mid-chortle, she caught notice of the prince and immediately burst up to show respect to the young lord. When she did, one of her bones caught a mug of ale and sent it flying through the air across the tavern floor. She screamed in horror as it almost hit the prince and stood frozen with fear at her error. The prince, despite this blunder, began to laugh, and after a few moments the woman joined in. Soon the tavern was ablaze again with laughter and merriment. Prince Caithus took a seat at the counter as the tavern master eagerly leaned upon it. "What'll it be today, my prince?" Caithus attempted to recall. "What is the one with the cinnamon, foxroot and apples?" "Ah, the golden dragonfly. That's the one." The tavern master whistled a merry chirp at one of the ale taps in the shape of a wooden maiden. The maiden carved into the tap awoke and grabbed a nearby mug, then began filling it with a brew brimmed with golden foam. After the drink was poured, the tap maiden stilled again, awaiting the call of the next drink. "And for you, my good lord," the barman asked the general. "The usual." The general nodded as a tap in the shape of a stout horse with a mane of blazing fire began to shoot a brew of black wheaten grain from its nostrils. The drink was dark as the starless waters of Xaqara, and its taste even darker. When Caithus rose the mug and set it to his lips, he was filled with a fire of comfort deep inside him. He smiled and took another small sip. "How is it, my prince?" asked the beaming barman as he leaned forward in anticipation. "As delightful as can be," cheered Caithus. The people of the tavern gave a cry of approval, at which the general rolled his eyes as he took a hearty chug from his own mug. The prince took notice of the general's reaction and laughed. "Always so solemn, Rhaegroth. You must learn to relax and rejoice in the comfort of good men and good drink." A weather-worn man sat next to Rhaegroth, with a fox curled round his neck. He coarsely chortled, "Like this, my lord," and drained his whole glass at once before breaking into a cackling laugh. He slammed the mug onto the counter, and his fox crawled down his arm to stick his snout in for a lick of the residue. Rhaegar took another chug, but this time when the prince had looked away, he looked at him with a deep and menacing glare. Long after dusk, the prince talked, for now the sun was almost completely behind the great edge of the horizon, painting the sky with faint violets and greys. An umbral sky that would prove to be sufficient cover for dark-robed figures now moving swiftly across the streets of the dimly lit market. They rushed effortlessly and silently across rooftops and through alleyways, wielding sharp knives and curved blades, clad in all black. The first to notice them was an old man who walked about the streets with a small lantern. He was quickly silenced as the shadowy forms dashed past him and slit his throat without ceasing their run. The only sound was the swift cutting of the knife across his flesh, then the gurgle of the blood spilling out from his throat, his lantern smashing onto the stone of the pavement, followed shortly by his old body. Next was a quiet beggar who slumbered on the side of a decaying building. As the ragged woman slowly opened her eyes, she felt a force push her back to the wall. She looked down and noticed 3 small knives invading her chest. As she looked up in shock, she saw the deadly men rushing by, then closed her heavy eyes in death. The prince continued his merrymaking. Almost all the other patrons had left the tavern and turned in for the night, but he and his guards and the foxman remained. The barman leaned in toward Kaithus and said, "My old chap Rumley says he's heard news that the Varar Patriciate is reforming, and has begun again a footing by the old western salt and iron mines, and that perhaps they have even begun to build another crucible on the foot of the Nazca. Is there any truth to this?" Kaithus furrowed his brow intriguingly. "Alas, I cannot say." The man with the fox rumbled, "Don't go asking questions you don't want the answer to." Kaithus echoed, "I think your friend might be right. Ignorance yields a stark shield against knowledge. Surrender it, and all illusionary comforts may fade. Though either way, I have no knowledge of such a thing. The first I've heard of it was from you. Perhaps, though, I should look into it." The tavern master nodded in agreement at the prince's warning. Kaithus continued, "What I do know, however, is that I should like another drink. Perhaps a round for the men in here as well." He was met again with a generous cheer as the taps began filling mugs immediately. Meanwhile, one of the watchmen atop the bell tower noticed something moving on the streets below. He saw a woman carrying a basket toward one of the alleyways before a lethal form dashed past her. As it did, she twisted and fell hard onto the stony pavement. The watchman gasped in horror and grabbed the ropes of the bell, but before he could pull them, he was jolted back by an arrow piercing through his chest. He stumbled around and fell backwards out of the tower. As he fell, his feet caught the ropes of the bell, resulting in a loud and forceful ring. His armor was no match for the hammer of the ground, causing his back to burst through his chest within the casing of the armor. The ringing of the bell resonated through the city, and the prince, who heard it a few blocks away, stopped talking immediately and looked up in the direction of the sound. The watchman in one of the sister towers heard the bell sounding and began to ring all the warning bells of his own. The general's face filled with concern, and his eyes began to glow with rage. The not show it. He hid it behind his now commanding voice as he directed two of the guards. Mathis, Cashin, go and see while the alarm is sounding. The two looked back with swords drawn and nodded at the prince before cautiously venturing out. A woman, sleeping peacefully in her bedroom, opened her eyes abruptly at the sound of the echoing bells. Without hesitation, she threw off her covers and sat up. She moved her long, dark hair off her ears and sat still for a moment. Then, in a burst of energy, she jumped up and grabbed an aged leather jerkin and dark leather boots. Out on the streets, the city guard began to search for the disturbance. Soon the attacking man began appearing from the shadows and rushed to the guards. Many of the guards were taken by surprise and slaughtered immediately. The others, who were quick enough to deflect the first blow, struggled to keep up in their heavy armor with the swiftness of the rapid and seemingly weightless movements of the shadowy men. The woman, now armored, ran out toward her door and grabbed the blue hilt of a long sword that leaned against the wall of her bedroom. The blade was long, wide, and made of dark grey metal befitting a warrior. It was heavy, but she carried it with ferocity. Mathis and Cashin were steadily moving through the expanse outside the tavern. They had not gotten far when one of the murderous men appeared and rushed toward them. They deftly repelled his swift blade. The man slashed at the guards, and they blocked with the crossing of their two swords. Cashin unsheathed the knife and quickly pushed it into the throat of the man, who then grabbed at his injury. As he did, Mathis slid his blade across his stomach, spilling out his guts. Cashin yelled back to the tavern, "Korrigan assassins!" The prince looked alarmed and ordered his company, "Guard the windows above as well. These men move like no other. They could come in any opening in this building." The guards quickly complied. The attacks continued outside, and many of the citizens who ran from the shadows were killed on their way around corners, by daggers thrusting out from the darkness, or by knives whirling through the air. One of the assassins pursued an old man, who stood no chance against his hunter's speed. He impaled the old man through the back, and the victim clenched his eyes in agony and fell, crying intensely on the cold ground. The assassin kneeled over the injured man and laughed. In the unmistakable accent of the mountainous jungles of Rangrast, he sentenced, "Go now to the dark abyss. Let the pain and suffering claim your decrepit soul." The man could do nothing more but weep. The smiling shadow suddenly noticed a tall, dark outline creep over him. He turned expecting to see one of his own men, but was surprised to find a woman there instead. Before he could say anything, she stole his breath as her sword passed through the pipes of his neck and then out to the other side. His now headless body crumpled to the floor. The woman looked down at the old man, who was no longer breathing. Her face was grave as she gazed at his wounded corpse. She looked also to the severed head that rolled on the ground. It looked so unnatural by itself. It still seemed like it was a person who could think and talk and laugh and breathe, yet it could not. It no longer belonged to the person, but if the head was what made up the person, then was it missing a body, or was the body missing a head? The woman suddenly had the urge to vomit, but she swallowed and refocused again. Then she looked away from the carnage and continued her pursuit. A Korrigan assassin flew through one of the upper windows in the tavern and kicked back the guard behind it. The guards now rushed toward him and began attacking him. He stabbed the one on the floor quickly, pressing them close. In one of the alleys, the woman met another assassin and swung at him. He parried her sword, then tried to strike at her, but she deflected it. She pushed him back with her hilt and sliced her blade into his right hand. It tore through most of the tendons and bones, leaving it dangling from the remaining ligaments. His bright red blood spilled out across the alleyway. Taking advantage of his pain, the woman opened him up across his chest with another swipe. More of him splattered out and across the floor before he landed dead in his own residue. Another enemy fell upon her from the rooftops. He came at her with his blade extended out, but she dropped low, spun around, and sliced one of his legs off. He landed hard on the ground, and she ferociously jammed her sword into his head through his eye. She took a large breath, then swiftly ran on. The woman noticed many of the fell enemies heading toward the tavern, where they engaged a battalion of soldiers. She quickly noticed the red armor of the prince's guards. Without delay, she hastened into the fray at the tavern. She ducked under a blade and returned a slash across the neck of a shadow. As she did, another man's curved blade met hers. The warrior managed to parry only once before she stabbed him in the groin, and then sliced upward at his chest and through his chin. The assassin fell backward, but the noise of the landing was masked by the cacophony of ringing swords and yelling. The onslaught seemed endless, and the prince had lost many of his guards. The assassins continued to rain in through the windows and jump over the bodies around them. The general, who was near the prince, noticed the woman outside successfully slaying many of the assassins. His face, however, showed not relief, but anger. The woman fought her way to the entrance. She jumped up and grabbed the door frame, swinging into the tavern and sending her blade diagonally through the neck and side of another assassin. She followed his weight down as the prince looked over to her with wide eyes. The woman looked up as she yanked her blade out of the assassin's pierced body. She moved toward one of the assassins, engaging a guard. The muscles in her arms began to ache, but she could not let up yet. She thrust her sword to his spine and then cut down another. The guards now fanned out across the room and seemed to be gaining the upper hand. The general grew enraged and yelled in anger before grabbing the prince and pulling him into the wall beneath the rise of the stairs. Eorrid drew a dagger and held it to the prince's throat. All the guards were too busy fighting to notice or intervene. Kaithis managed a small cry that caught the attention of the woman. She rushed over, held her sword up in the air and yelled, "Release him!" The prince's eyes were filled with fear and confusion. He questioned, "Eorrid, what's the meaning of this?" The general ordered, "Silence." The woman began to feel shaky but shouted again, "Release him now." Eorrid yelled back, "Who in Udolna's name are you? What makes you think you can defeat me? Drop your blade, or I will expel the contents of his neck across the room." Kaithis reached slowly for a knife from one of the bodies of the dead assassins on the stairs above him. The woman saw this and gently placed her sword down on a nearby table, keeping eye contact with the general. Eorrid took a few quick glances around the room and said, "Good, now move away from the sword." The prince, however, drove a knife into the general's side. Eorrid's knife slightly cut the prince as Kaithis moved away. Eorrid looked up and threw his dagger to the side before drawing his sword, ready to rush at the prince, but found the woman had also grabbed her blade and so instead. She blocked him just before he struck her face. The prince was stunned as he watched the two battle viciously. She was quick, but so was Rhaegroth. She took note of his wound and struck high. Then, as he blocked, she kicked the wound in his side. He screamed in pain, but was still able to block her next swing. He began making wide swipes at her, but to little avail as she dodged or blocked everyone. Finally, his sword just missed her and lodged into the table beside her. He tried to pull the blade out, but it caused his side too much pain. The woman took advantage of this opportunity and drew her sword back. She swung it forward, ripping through the flesh of Rhaegroth's side, cutting him almost completely in half. He gasped in pain, and she put her boot on his chest, using her foot as leverage to pry her blade out. As she did, he pulled out chunks of intestines, and the chasm left by the sword gushed blood into the air. He toppled over to the floor with a crash. Blood escaped from his mouth, and his once intimidating eyes were paralyzed in defeat. As the last of the assassins was stabbed through the chest by a guard, the prince looked to the woman with great surprise and interest. The sounds of heavy breathing filled the room. Many also supposed their heartbeats could be heard as they pounded through their sweat-soaked chests. Blood dripped off the tip of the woman's sword to disappear into a sea of corpses and severed limbs below. The tavern master, who had been cowering in the corner of the room, leaned his head back against the wall in relief. The woman looked around at the guards who were now all staring at her. No one said anything. The prince swallowed and regained his composure. He broke the silence. "Thank you for your aid." The woman began to feel a different kind of nervousness. The prince inquired, "Do you know who I am?" She carefully replied, "Yes, your grace, your Prince Kindness." "Who are you, and how were you able to stop all those men?" The woman stood still for a moment, then finally said, "My name is Amelia. I live in and work in the southern market, and I try to watch over the people here when I can. Otherwise, I am no one of any importance." Kindness interjected, "Not no one. You just saved my life, though I have no idea why Rhaegroth turned on us. He was a good man, whom I had known for many years. I don't know why he did that." He looked to Rhaegroth's body in shock once more. Amelia spoke again. "I know not. I'm only here because I heard the bells ringing. I grabbed my sword and ran outside to find many of my people being slaughtered. I tried to stop as many as I could and followed them here to the wyvern, where I happened to find you and your men. It seems unlikely that you came by chance. I would be dead if not for your aid. You fought better than all my men. However did you learn to fight like such?" "Thank you, my prince. I began practicing when I was little. My father taught me, and after my parents died, I practiced with various traveling swordsmen who came through the market. But it's mostly luck, though, for none of my teachers had any formal training. Themselves, I probably just have a slight advantage because people don't expect to see a woman fighting, and it catches them off guard." Kindness stared at her with great interest and wonder. She did not look away as he examined her. She was thinner than he would expect for one so strong. She had a proud jawline, with deep, beautiful cheekbones not often found in one as young as she. Amelia's fair hands were rough and coated in blood and residue from a forge, and her dark brown hair fell in sweat-drenched waves over her motley brown eyes. finished surveying her, he took a deep breath and looked to his men. "We shall return to the castle, bring Raygroth's body, and have it prepared for burial. We shall treat him with dignity until we learn the reason for his betrayal. Burn the others on posts in front of the castle as a warning to whoever attacked us. But first, search them to see if we can find any clues as to the cause of their attack. And cover up the bodies of our fallen. We shall bury them too when the sun rises." Cashen questioned the prince. "Should we inform the people about Raygroth? A statement can be given tomorrow about him, and that any who should seek to combat us will meet the same end. But I shall not yet call him a villain until we know more. He may yet be a victim like us." Cashen and the other guards nodded as they began to gather him up. Kythus looked at Amelia again and proposed, "I would greatly appreciate it if you came with us to the castle. I want to ask you a few more questions and reward you for assisting us." Amelia nodded. Amelia noticed the prince's men stop their work to look at her, anticipating a response. She nodded in confirmation at the smiling prince. The castle was an indomitably proud building. Its ancient grey stonework was strewn with countless windows and towers. The top was adorned with a colossal dome, featuring many rings and carvings that ate away at the stone as they encased it. Red and black flags waved from atop the walls and spires, in honor of the prince, save the topmost flag, the high banner of veneration, proudly announcing the rule of the king in colors of blue and gold. The fortress was ancient but ageless. The stones had not darkened nor shattered since its construction. It was located on a plateau in the north of the city and overlooked all the buildings below. Amelia was escorted by the prince's company to the front gate of the castle. As they arrived, someone yelled, "Prince Kythus has returned. Open the gate." The structure began to creak. Amelia wondered how the gate would open as she looked to the large black door, in sheer contrast to the bright stonework surrounding it. Chains thumped and clattered as the gate fell straight down between the stonework of the floor around it. It landed with an echoing clank, rattling Amelia's bones. She was cautious with her next step over the great hole in the earth. Something made her feel that either she would fall in, or something would fly from her pockets and straight down the gap. Whether there was logic to it or not, she proceeded nervously. She walked through the opening and looked up at the marvelous ceiling. The archways towered high, exposing a great wide open space. Amelia could see her own overwhelmed expression in the reflective marble floor. The chandeliers were adorned with thousands of opulent crystals. Amelia couldn't help but think she could afford half the market with a single chandelier. The fortress had endured many kings, and was adorned to reflect their lasting splendor and pride. As they walked, Amelia felt something under her foot. She lifted her boot to find one of the crystals that had fallen from the chandeliers above. She wondered if she should pocket it to sell, and use the money to help the people of the southern market. But she didn't know who would buy it, or how she would feel taking from someone, even if they were already so wealthy. So she told the prince of her discovery. She held it out to him, and he thanked her as he took it. Amelia was surprised when, instead of asking someone to restore the crystal to its place, he simply chucked it over his shoulder and out one of the nearby windows. She looked at him in surprise. but he shrugged and kept walking. Now she wished she had kept it, as whatever she would have done with it would have been better than throwing it out a window. As they entered another large chamber, a man swiftly approached them. His green and tan robes were short and elegant like that of a refined soldier. His hair was a blend of blondes that was shaved off on one side and pulled back on the other for combat. The sides were separated by a thin braid. Amelia took note of his refined beard as he spoke in a deep, quick voice. "Lord Kythis, I heard of the attack in the southern market. Are you all right?" The company halted and the prince responded, "I'm all right, thanks. I lost a few of my men, though." The man scanned the company. When he spotted Cashin, his face relaxed in relief. Kythis continued, "You shall have to train more for my guard." The man replied unhappily, "I cannot promise they will last any longer, for raw talent is hard to find these days. Other than Cashin, your guard is still lacking." Kythis did not seem as concerned as the man, and said, "Speaking of talent, I was helped by someone in the attack that was rife with it." Kythis turned and looked at Amelia, and the sullen man followed the prince's gaze. Despite his obvious surprise, the man continued, "A most fortunate encounter, whoever you might be." His eyes gleamed like daggers, brimming with distrust and caution. The prince said, "Lord Amtros, this is Amelia. She is a defender of the people in the southern section of the city. Amelia, this is Lord Amtros, master of the guard of Valcorana. He leads all the guards of the city, including those of the king and myself." The man held himself up tall and proud as the prince continued to describe him. "He is also the head combat instructor. He trained me and many of the other warriors here, but I think he would have been impressed if he had seen you in combat today." Amtros gruffly mumbled, "Perhaps." Amelia bowed to him and said, "I appreciate the prince's kind words, but they may be an exaggeration of my ability. I still have much to learn." Amtros said nothing, but stared at her and grunted in agreement. Amelia knew not why he was so sour, but preferred not to stick around and find out. Kythis, quite aware of Amtros's hostility, broke the awkward moment with an order of urgency. "Send for my father, Amtros. I have much that needs discussed. Raygroth betrayed me, and I have no notion as to why." Amtros blinked a few times and questioned, "Raygroth, it cannot be. He has been a loyal officer for many years. Are you sure you are not mistaken?" Kythis confirmed assertively, "I am not mistaken. His betrayal and attack on us was quite clear, though why is not yet evident. It is all still a blur in my mind, and a shock to my heart." Amelia and the company ventured through the castle. They passed through many grand hallways and rooms, occasionally losing one of their numbers as they went their separate ways. Each room was more decorative than the last. Eventually, they came to the grand office of the king. Now, only Kythis, Amelia, Amtros, and the prince's guard Cashin remained. There were 2 guards in front of the doorway. Their station was signified by their long robes of deep red, grey, and black. They wore metal-plated masks, gleaming silver lion visages. The masks and their thick hoods hid their faces completely. The 2 guards opened the door, and Kythis strode through. Amelia followed shortly behind. The others who followed stopped and bowed to a figure ahead of her as they entered. In front of the prince eyes now white with age. His hands, with which he could once wield great heavy weapons, only retained a fraction of their former strength. Yet his bright blue eyes were youthful and piercing like that of a young warrior. His ornate and luxurious robes draped all the way to the floor, and his hair was pulled back as if he expected a fight at all times. He looked to Caiaphas, and his voice rang like thunder. "My son, I heard of the attack at the market. Tell me what happened." Caiaphas complied and began to explain. "We were attacked by Corkin assassins. They flew in from all around us. We held them off as best we could, but near the end of the attack, Rhaegroth turned at us and held a knife to my throat." "Rhaegroth, you're sure of this?" "Yes, I'm sure." Thasion took a moment to process the news. He looked to the cut on Caiaphas' neck and touched it, causing Caiaphas to gasp from the sting. Thasion looked at him with displeasure and said, "Men do not weep at the whisper of a blade, nor wince from the wound thereafter." Caiaphas looked away from his father uncomfortably as the king made his way around the room, stopping in front of Amelia. He called out, "And who is this you brought here?" Caiaphas began. "Her name is," but was cut off by the king. "She can speak for herself, Caiaphas." The prince silenced himself as commanded. Then the king took 2 steps toward Amelia. He looked deeply into her eyes. Amelia didn't dare look away. He asked, "What is your name, my dear?" The woman held her ground and confidently stated, "Amelia." "And what was your business in all of this?" "Amelia." Caiaphas looked at her, but she did not look away from the king. She replied, "I was simply trying to help the defenseless. I heard the warning bells ringing, and I grabbed my blade. When I realized who was attacking us, I jumped in and started helping. I fought my way through the assailants and came upon the prince. And as I did, the general seemed to turn on him. And if I'm not mistaken, it seemed to me that he was angry and the attack was not successful. The prince grabbed a nearby knife and stabbed him. I saw a chance to strike and did so. I killed him because by my judgment, had I not, he would have tried to kill the prince." The king's stoic expression faded after a few moments, and he began to nod. "Well, it seems to be a good thing that you did." Amelia breathed in relief before Thasion spoke. "The prince and I will have much to discuss. I bid that you stay here tonight. We will deliver you the finest meats and wines in all of the capital. Then, when we are finished talking, I will send someone to further instruct you." Amelia bowed her head and said, "Thank you, your grace." Cashin directed her out. Amelia was escorted to one of the upper mead halls. There she was served many meats and wines as promised, including serpent meat brought by the Rangrassian traders. She had seen the men passing through the market, but never thought she would get to taste their delicacies. It made her feel most privileged. Cashin sat and ate with her as well. She thought he looked quite young for a royal guard, and handsome too. Before long she felt comfortable enough to ask him, "Do you think the king was pleased with me?" Cashin chuckled and responded, "I'm sure if he wasn't, you'd know about it." Amelia raised her brow and convinced herself that his statement was logical enough to return to her food. Back in Thasion's office, he stood leaning against his desk with his hand on his chin in great contemplation. Caiaphas stood across from him with his arms crossed. that seemed to turn on you? Kaithis confirmed. Yes, he seemed angry the whole night, or at least more than usual. Amelia said he looked furious that the Korrikins were being killed. Then he surely wanted them there. But was it you who summoned him, or was it circumstantial? Kaithis asserted he had to have something to do with their attack, sure as stone. As to why and how much, I do not know. But he knew we would be going to visit the Wyvern that night, away from the safety of the castle. So this must have been planned for some time now. Scion moved over to look out one of his decorated windows. Hiring the Korrikins would cost a great deal of coin, money enough that only someone as rich as he could bring forth so many of their men. They also didn't try to attack him, which could be further confirmation of his involvement. Though I still suspect he did not act alone. As bitter as he was at times, his heart could not have devised such evil, said Kaithis. Scion produced a great huff of agreement before asking, Did your men find anything on the corpses of the assassin? Kaithis shook his head. No, they were too sophisticated to leave any clue to their course behind. Of course they were. Kaithis said nothing to this and waited for his father to continue. Scion then said with a proud smile, What a fool to think they could attack the line of kings and live to tell the tale. No, we have not yet withered away as they thought, and we will not soon do so. Kaithis looked down at this and uncomfortably reminded his father. Yes, but he would have succeeded if not for Amelia. I was not able to sense his betrayal. Scion's smile faded, but he did not deign to speak. He didn't need to for Kaithis to feel his disappointment. After a long pause, the king spoke again. Tell me more of this Amelia you found. Kaithis looked back up to him and began to relive all he had witnessed. After the meal, Amelia wandered out to one of the castle overlooks. The sun was beginning to fall behind the edge of the world. She watched its radiant descent atop the ledge while taking in the vast beauty of the view. She had never seen so perfect a sight in all her days. Amelia now saw all the ancient stonework of the castle, the building tops all around the city, and the great city wall at the edge. She could also see many trees and the great mountain ranges that guarded the capital from the ocean, the Valcorana and the Glisraithel, which were great and tall, even so far off in the distance. Before she could finish taking it all in, Prince Kaithis walked up next to her. She jumped slightly at his arrival. He laughed and stated, I've lived here all my life, but I don't usually come out here. I need to, so I don't miss sights like this. Amelia was surprised at his comment and said, Oh, if I had a view like this, I would visit it almost every day. The prince laughed again and asked, Would you like to? Amelia looked over at him in bewilderment, then questioned, What do you mean? Kaithis spoke cheerfully. My father and I discussed the attack with the councillors. We came to the conclusion that bravery like that which you exhibited is now seldom found in this world. You were truly fearless. Amelia negated. I was far from fearless. Perhaps on the outside I looked brave, but inside I was terrified. Regardless, I had to protect my people from harm. Would no others do the same? Kaithis moved a bit close to her and countered. Not like you did. You challenged the general, one of the greatest warriors and defenders in the kingdom, without hesitation, and you won. You helped save my life and the lives of many of the people of Valcorana. Amelia smiled modestly. She replied, "Perhaps it is so, but I often feel like I make little difference. Even if I did today, it's not enough. It never is." Kaivis looked out over the balcony again. He thought to himself for a brief moment, then pondered out loud. What if I could offer you a way to make a bigger difference? What do you mean? I mean, what if I offered you the position of General of the Royal Army and Capital? Amelia gasped, astonished. What? Me? Surely you cannot mean me. Kaivis ensured, I'm completely serious. Amelia continued to try and process the situation as Kaivis went on. I know it's sudden. I did not expect anything that happened today to have happened, and much less that we would come to such a proposal so swiftly. This cannot be real. With all due respect, you must be crazy. Why would you ever contemplate such a decision? How do you know I would do well? You don't know anything about me. Kaivis soothingly stated, I know what I need to know. There is something about you that feels right for it. But I am not a leader. No less than I, and the parts you need help with can be taught. Amelia wondered aloud, would the other officers not be angered that they would not first be promoted? None of the other officers could best Rhaegar, and even fewer would have the heart to try. With you, we could build you into the general that is right for this capital, instead of just picking the best of what we already have. I see, she said, although she didn't actually understand. I think it's time this kingdom did something different for once, something brave, and I think you could be the next step in growing this kingdom for the better. You may not be the perfect leader yet, but all the great leaders I know started from nothing. You have the same heart they did, you have the same potential, and you didn't save me for nothing. You were meant to be there that day, for whatever reason. So it's yours if you will accept it. Amelia looked down and tried to catch her breath. She stammered. She swallowed and questioned. Would I be able to think it over? The prince answered, Of course. Take a few days to think about it. He calmly added, I will respect whatever answer you give me, but I think you have a great deal of potential, and I should like to get to know you more and learn about where you came from. And if for some reason it should not be the position for you, I shall relieve you of it with no consequence. Amelia smiled despite feeling supremely overwhelmed. When you've decided, I'll be here, said the prince. He beamed widely at her,